Why can I not hear anything?
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am Martha Mathers, Head of Research at SBI, and I am so excited to be joined by Nancy Narden, formerly of Smart Selling Tools, recently acquired by SBI. Nancy, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
SBI is a B2B growth advisory firm, so we cover all things revenue growth, from strategy to sales, marketing, success, all things growth execution. And of course, the reason we're all here today, thinking about commercial technology and specifically sales tech and how sales tech underpins growth capabilities. Hopefully you can see the presentation up on the screen right now. If you can't, use the chat feature and we will be in touch to make sure we get you the materials. In addition, we will answer questions through the chat feature throughout the presentation, and then we'll do some live Q&A at the end. So probably about 40 minutes or so of content, and then excited to have a bit more of an interactive discussion with you all. So with that, we'll dive right in. If we take a look at the next slide, a rapidly changing landscape, I'll ask the question, okay, why are we here talking about sales tech? Between growth demands and talent challenges that we know many of our clients are facing, in fact, I'd say almost every company that we work with is looking at how to improve productivity and efficiency. So when you think about how technology plays in there through automation, analytics, easing the overall commercial experience, you can see on this slide super clearly the market's responding. There are more than 1,200 sales tech solutions available for purchase, not to mention MarTech, success tools, et cetera. 97% of commercial leaders in a recent SBI survey suggested that they were planning to purchase more commercial technology in 2022. So they were increasing their budget there. And through the work that we just completed, we saw that about a quarter of sales budgets are actually going towards tools and technologies that support either the selling or buying experience. So lots of investment, lots of options. Companies want to make sure that they are making the right investments and maximizing value. So that takes us straight into our discussion today: why sales tech can underdeliver and what to do about it. So this slide serves as a nice agenda for how we'll spend our time looking at 5 reasons your sales tech stack isn't delivering and what you can do. From too many tools to immature processes and so on, we'll take each one of these in turn, share some new data and perspective, and hopefully leave you with some great takeaways as you think about your plans for 2022. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, and we'll begin by looking at our sales tech landscape. Nancy, you built this a couple of years ago, maybe more than a couple. What does it look like today, and why did you create it?
Yeah, thanks, Martha. And as Martha mentioned, there are 1,200 plus sales tech solutions on the market. What's even or just as interesting is that there are 49 different types of sales solutions. So often we just think of CRM when we're talking about sales tech, but there in fact is a lot more solutions available. The reason I put together this landscape is, one, just to have one graphic that put all the solutions onto one map so that you can see what tools and what vendors are available for solving different problems. And then also it provides a great framework to help companies just organize their thinking as to what they already have, what they might need, and where there might be some overlap. I will just point out that the sections in the dark blue, the medium, and the light blue, those represent tools that are aimed at sellers, enablement, and management and ops. And together, those make up what we call the 7 sales funnel stages. But any way you look at it, it's just a lot of tools to consider and to keep track of. I think what might work is to just, let's put all the logos aside and get a clean view of the 7 sales funnel stages on the next slide. And what you'll notice here is that obviously it looks a lot less confusing, but I wanted to be able to show the stages that are pulled directly from the landscape and represent how we monitor and how do we categorize sales tech. So this cleaner version of the landscape shows the framework, and you'll see this again later when we're talking about installations of different technologies and how sales organizations are using and gaining value from them. But the way to think about this, if you're needing reps to, say, build a more robust pipeline or ensure that they're better communicating with their prospects and getting better outcomes from that outreach, you should be looking at tools in the prioritize and engage stages. If you've brought in a ton of new people and you need to ramp them quickly, then you might want to look at tools in the develop stage. And I guess another way to look at it is if you have say a low win-loss ratio, then you might want to look at tools in the earn and win stages. That's kind of the fastest way to think about where and how to look at the landscape itself. So let's say you need reps to get prospects to engage more quickly or predictably. Then again, that would be engage. And I want to go into a deeper view, go back to the landscape and take a look at just that engage section of the landscape. And I'll take you through how to read and make sense of that. So first of all, engage has by far the highest number of types of tools. So again, what you would see here in the blue boxed headings are the categories of tools that help a rep engage. And it also has the highest number of vendor options to pick from. So there are actually a total of 230 vendors that can help your sellers engage more effectively with prospects and opportunities or customers. So if enabling your reps to engage faster and more effectively with prospects is important, start here. And you can also take a look at, well, what are the problems we're trying to solve? Right? If what we're trying to do is get a better or higher increase of volume of calls, then maybe you want to look at lead engagement or dialers. And if you're looking for things that will help you grab the attention of a prospect and differentiate you and help sellers be more relevant, then you would want to look at things like embellished email or sales engagement. So again, that's just kind of an idea of how to read the SalesTech framework. But the bigger question is, what are companies using today and to what extent are they delivering value? That's really where we're headed today. Over the past few months, we've done extensive analysis across the landscape with our SalesTech audit study. So Martha, why don't I have you give a quick overview of what this research was all about?
Yeah, sounds great. So time and time again, we hear questions around what should my sales tech stack look like? What tools are the right tools for me? How do I build a stage appropriate combination of tools to help support our process? And so what we wanted to do was really take a snapshot across many different companies to capture exactly what their sales tech stacks look like today. So to just walk you across the page, on the left-hand side, we did an overall audit or almost inventory of some of the tools in use. We captured technologies and tools across the 49 different categories that you saw in the landscape. And then we looked at how many tools, what types of tools were at work within each stage of the sales process. And then finally, we asked, what do you plan to purchase across the next 12 to 18 months? What comes next? Then once we captured that, we also wanted to take a look at the tools themselves and perceptions around how well they were performing, as well as kind of true hard performance results as well. So we asked a series of questions around importance to your day-to-day operations, adoption, are you using the full potential of those tools? How well are you enabling reps or other end users? And then what type of ROI or efficiency gains are you experiencing? And then lastly, we just wanted to look at the purchase process with 1,200 different tools to evaluate how many people are involved, how structured is the process, what does implementation look like as companies consider how to get the most out of the tools that they purchase. A little bit of detail on the lower left around just the company respondents that are reflected here. About 90 B2B organizations, a minimum of 100 million in revenue. And this audit is something that many of our clients have taken advantage of and will continue to do so. So happy to answer questions on that front as well. So with that, I'll hand it back to Nancy as we dive into reason number one, the idea of too many tools and how to get to the right ones for you.
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, so the research uncovered the 5 reasons that we're going to be talking about today. And the first reason is a reflection of what I spoke about a second ago in terms of the landscape. There's just too many tools. So this is what I refer to as the paradox of choice. And there's actually a book by that name, which if you haven't read it is a fantastic book. And Barry Schwartz, the author of that book, points out that more isn't always better, especially when it comes to decision making. The more options, the more complexity, and complexity, it slows things down. And the sales tech landscape is as good an example of the paradox of choice as any. Determining how many and which solutions to buy requires thoughtful evaluation and a defined process. But even with the large number of options available, our research showed that organizations purchased on average 27 sales tools.
Nancy, what's your take on that? 27 in the context of 1,200 might not sound like a lot, but 27 across the 7 categories that we looked like from a sales process, that starts to sound like a good bit more.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit on the high end, but perhaps not when you consider that there are 7 different stages in the sales funnel that you need to account for and ensure that your reps are enabled to perform at their highest. And then you multiply that out by the number of solutions that are available to solve different challenges. I always like to say there are just as many challenges or problems to solve as there are solutions on this landscape. So it's surprising, but not really surprising.
And then how about the average number of planned tool purchases? 4, by contrast, seemed really low to me, just thinking, again, we're monitoring 7 different stages of the sales process. That isn't even 1 tool per stage. So what's your take there?
Yeah, that's a good point. It is less than 1 tool per stage. And I think what happens is that companies aren't exceptionally forward looking. They're kind of playing whack-a-mole and trying to solve the problems that surface in the moment. Or as an example, we all know that sales leaders are getting tons of phone calls from reps, and on occasion they hear about a solution that seems really interesting and exciting. So they will, want to grab onto that, but it's not part of this overall forward-looking plan, and it wouldn't be counted in this number of 4 solutions that people are considering buying in the next 12 months. So I don't know, I think the more important question isn't so much how many tools are in use, but are we solving problems at each stage of the funnel, which actually leads me to the next slide. And when we analyzed with our study the use of tools across the different stages of the funnel, we really wanted to understand the overall usage. So if you look at the blue bars, they show on average what % of the available tools are in use. And if you look at develop, 65, that's the one on the very far right side, you can see that there's an adoption of 65% of the available tools in use, but there's only 2 types of tool categories. So it's not surprising that 65% of them are in use by our respondents. Engage, on the other hand, which is the second bar from the left, has a fairly low penetration of tool usage at 48%. But that's a fairly high number of tools, considering that it means close to 7 different types of tool categories are actually in use. So there's more tools being used in Engage than there are in Develop, even though the adoption of technology, of the % of solutions isn't quite as high. And many specific solutions fall into each bucket and are in use to help with each of these stages in the funnel. It's more than what's used for earning the business, as an example. So the sheer number of tools in use is really relative to the funnel stage.
Got it. And then one quick question in response to something you just shared. There's no reason that I might not have multiple tools in a single category, right? So if I might, if there are 7 categories in earn, I could still have 14 tools potentially.
That's true. That's true. So this slide is actually looking at the types of tools or the tool categories in use, not the actual number of solutions themselves. Because as you said, you could have more than one. It's very typical for a company to have more than one lead database service, as an example. They might have Zoom Info, and they may have a couple of others like LinkedIn Navigator.
Great point. Thank you. And then if I look down at the bottom, we pulled in here, I know, the top tools in use at each stage. Some didn't surprise me at all, looking at something like online video meetings. We've been living in Zoom, and there it is right on the slide. But when you looked across some of the other categories, is there anything else that jumped off the page from your perspective?
Well, yeah, actually, the very first one on the bottom left, which is under prioritize, the fact that it's on lead engagement was just a little surprising, because I would have thought that lead list database solutions would be the #1, because you have to have a list of contacts and how to reach them in order to deploy or make use of a lead engagement solution. But if I think about it, marketing tends to fuel, the top of the funnel. And so if marketing is driving enough inbound leads, then it makes sense to have lead engagement be the one that is viewed as the most important, or the tool that's used most frequently.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Mhm. All right, so moving on, we'll hit the second reason why tools maybe aren't delivering for your organization, and that has to do with processes. So what do I mean by immature processes? It really breaks out into two categories, and that is the purchase process. How are we making decisions on which tools we should be purchasing? And the implementation process. How are we going about making sure that we're rolling it out in an effective way, and that our sellers are using the tools? So if you consider the full breadth of choice that we have and the amount of money being invested, you would think that the process for evaluating, purchasing, and implementing tools would be important to get right. And yet what I find interesting is on the left-hand side in the light blue, 61% have what they would categorize as a somewhat structured purchase process. So, having different decision makers and evaluation processes for different tools, and just not having a very clearly defined process in general, it just invites unnecessary risk of a low ROI. And then if I look at implementation on the right-hand side, again, in the light blue, it's somewhat more mature, but there's still less than half of the respondents said they had a clearly defined implementation process, which sparks concerns, because first you're saying, well, we're not really that organized in terms of purchasing. And then once we do purchase, we're not that organized when it comes to ensuring that we get the value. So I would suggest asking two questions. One is, who's going to measure and determine whether we're getting the full potential? And who will be responsible for determining what good looks like and whether that's even being achieved? So often, we'll get our solutions. We have a good plan in place for the first 2 weeks to roll it out. And then we get busy with other things because there isn't one person who has a roadmap for continuous reinforcement, or to be responsible for making sure that the tool is actually delivering.
Yeah, and that makes, I think, a lot of sense as we move into the next section as well.
Yeah. All right. So the next section is maybe, given what I've just said, is not surprising, and that is that the tools themselves are being underutilized. What we have on this slide is really just the sum, percentage for all of the tools in each stage in terms of whether or not they're being used to their full potential. So when we talk about adoption, what we mean and what we defined in the study was the extent to which a company is using the full potential of the tool. Sometimes adoption can mean what percent of the reps are actually using it. In this case, we're asking about how fully leveraged the tool itself is. And so what we did is we took the scores here of those respondents who said they agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that yes, the tool is offering, that they're leveraging the tool to its full potential. So we're looking at an aggregate of how well adopted these tools are at each stage. And when it comes to justifying the budget for these tools, it's hard to defend if you're not realizing the promise that is caused you to buy the tool to begin with. And to be clear, it's not necessarily the fault of the vendor, although you should be expecting them to ensure that those numbers are higher. But companies have an obligation to train, enable, and administer a solution so that the full value is realized.
Nancy, the thing that grabs my eye is the far right-hand side of this slide. When I look at develop and the adoption jumps up a bit there, what's your take on why we're so much better at driving adoption in the develop stage?
Yeah, that's a good question. They all are kind of even in the 42 to 47% rate, but definitely develop is a lot higher. And I think what's happening there is that the developed solutions are typically run by a small group of people called sales enablement professionals who are tasked with making sure that these solutions are being used to their fullest. So that part isn't really that surprising. And then the other piece of it is that like prioritize and engage, these solutions are being used by thousands perhaps of reps, where developed solutions, coaching, sales skills development, et cetera, are probably being used by fewer at any one point in time, because it's those reps that are being onboarded or those that are going back for certification and things like that. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how those tools are deployed.
Got it. And maybe even a little more skin in the game. If I'm enablement, I wanted to buy the tool and now I'm using the tool, versus wanting to buy a tool that then is passed over to my reps, who may or may not want to necessarily use the tool.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point. But we wanted to slice the data in a different way as well. And that is, let's compare the adoption level to the tools that our respondents rated to be their top tools. So this is important to think about, right? This slide shows in the dark blue, these are the tools that the respondents said were critical to their day-to-day operations. Online video meetings on the far left had the highest score for that, and that's not surprising. But if you look across the board here, the results are not great. The light blue bars actually represent the percent of adoption, or to what degree they're using these tools to their fullest. And what we're saying here is that even though these tools are critical to our day-to-day operations, we're not really leveraging them to the extent that we should be. And if we look at a few of these as an example, you can see account and opportunity management in the middle, and then value selling and ROI, and sales content management off to the far right. The gaps there is the biggest between how important the tool is and whether or not we have it fully adopted. So why is that? I think one reason might be that these tools are more complicated, and also that they offer more functionality. And so it could be that they just haven't been in place long enough, or the training and enablement isn't taking place, or that there's so much functionality that it's just going to take a while for it to get deployed. And I'll give you an example for opportunity and account management solutions. You might be using them initially just to create your plan and to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But there are a lot of other functions that you could leverage, like understanding what the buyer sentiment is across the buying team, and then also doing some white space mapping to understand where your opportunities are for cross-selling and upselling. So it can just take a while to get to all of the functionalities in each of these tools. But I guess the bottom line is the greatest opportunity for improvement is where the gap here on this chart is the biggest. Martha, why don't I ask you to take over on this next one, and I'll take a break and get a sip of water.
Sounds good. So as we move into this next section, we move from adoption, which is using the full promise, full potential of the tool, to enablement, and just the extent to which end users are ready to go fully trained on the tool. So as we take a look at the next slide, we're actually going to shift a little bit from the SalesTech audit data to some recent research we did at SBI related to this war on talent that seems to come up in almost every conversation. What we did here is we wanted to explore what keeps sellers engaged, happy, performing in seat. And really what we were looking to do is what has the greatest impact on seller retention. If you're interested in learning more about this work, we can certainly share it in more depth. But at a very high level, what we did is we took a pretty significant sample of quota-carrying sales reps. We asked them all kinds of questions about their seller experience. And then based on those responses, we did a factor analysis and then modeled what had the greatest impact on retention. Factor analysis is a fancy way to say we looked at how we could reduce the many questions to a small group of categories where everything in the category moved together in a statistically significant way. Those are the 8 categories you see across this chart. And for today's purposes, I'm just going to zero in on one: sales process and tools. We were a little bit surprised to see, given the focus on technology, that sales technology and overall kind of structure around sales process was a pretty poor driver of sellers' intent to stay with their organization. SalesTech also ranked 8 out of 11 possible reasons a seller might accept a new role. And so not a strong performer overall, but I don't think the way to read that data is that sales tag doesn't matter or can't improve a rep's experience. I think the low score is that sellers aren't necessarily well served or well enabled to use the tools that they have today. And that, I think, is really the key takeaway here. It's that the tools aren't serving them particularly well. So on the next slide, we do a little bit of a similar look at the data, looking again at the most important tools, which Nancy shared a couple slides back, technology that's critical to day-to-day operations. And we look at that side by side with enablement and the % of respondents agreeing that they've fully trained and enabled relevant end users. So these scores actually look a little bit higher, and I'll share what might be a slightly cynical hypothesis here. Here, many of our respondents were in operations or enablement roles. We asked that audience how well they had trained and enabled relevant end users. So they're on the hook for that enablement, which I think may have boosted the scores just a little bit versus asking a seller, for example, how well have you been trained and enabled on value selling and ROI tools. So I'll leave you with that to noodle on, but a couple other things pop off this page. When you look at enablement, some of these tools are pretty critical to day-to-day operations and business metrics. So customer onboarding and product adoption, about half of respondents agreed that they had done a good job with enablement here. It's a pretty impactful set of solutions or technologies for impacting retention. Account and opportunity management that might be impacting your deal cycle, for example, or your overall sales process. Value selling and ROI, maybe looking at time to close. So as you look across these enablement scores, they don't look that bad, but I would argue they don't look that good either as we think about this overall takeaway of tech deployment potentially lagging due to enablement limitations. So with that, I'll hand it back to Nancy, and we'll move into reason number 5 here, looking at short-term versus long-term focus when it comes to sales technology.
Yep, I think this comes back to that whole paradox of choice and the fact that often there isn't just one person or group that's responsible for analyzing which sales tech should be deployed and when over the long term. And so that can be for sure a reason why companies don't get as much as they could be getting from their sales technology. In this next slide, I've really outlined here in my experience, the best way for companies to build a tech roadmap or to think in terms of long-term view is first and foremost to consider what your overall corporate objectives are. And then keep those in mind as you do all the other things that you need to do in order to develop a roadmap. Because often, as I said, someone will find a tool and it'll look very interesting, and it is, and it will solve a problem. But just adopting it right then and there without considering where does it fit in the overall landscape of tools that you already have, and how does it solve one of the corporate objectives that you are looking to solve compared to other tools that you may already use. And then the next step would be to determine what capabilities are key for sellers to achieve their part. In other words, if you want them to sell more in less time at the right price, et cetera, what are the capabilities that you need to make sure you provide for that to them so that they can accomplish those tasks? Once you've done that, then you can identify, well, where are their capability gaps? Because we already know what we have in our stack And if you don't, we can help you with that. But assuming you already know what you have, you can compare, well, is there a way that we could use our existing tech stack to close those gaps? And that's often a great approach because you've already made the investment, and we've already talked about how all the functionality is not necessarily being used. So that is one way to do it, is to understand the capability gaps and then look for those solutions you already have that can close those capability gaps. And if you don't have some, then you can look for, well, what are the tools that we should be thinking about to build out our roadmap and to close those gaps over time? And this whole process is not easy. So instead, organizations often react to just an urgent need without regard to how the solution fits in. I've already, talked about that. Or, a sales leader gets a demo. I mean, again, it's back to this whole whack-a-mole approach. So let's look at how a short-term view plays out based on the data and what that looks like. Martha mentioned that we asked about their future purchase plans for the next 12 months. And this chart lists the top 10 solutions that are planned for purchase within the next 12 months. And then, well, let me first start by telling you what you're looking at here. The x-axis on the bottom shows the percent who plan to purchase the particular tool. And then the y-axis represents the percent of companies that already have this technology. And we brought in a little bit more detail here in terms of the color coding, which just indicates of these solutions, which stage does it fall into. So those solutions in the first call out box are already being highly deployed, which indicates that companies who are planning to purchase them are really just playing catch up with their peers. Of course, what you really want is to be ahead of the competition, not to just be playing catch up. And you could even consider the solutions in the second box to be certainly fundamental to a seller success, even though they're not used by as many companies presently. One of them, as an example, conversation optimization, is relatively new functionality, which may explain why it's not adopted at as high of a level as the ones in box one. And scheduling automation and website scheduling, they're interesting automation at the front end of the sales process, which leads to making it easier to engage with leads faster. But they're not super innovative, AI, machine learning type fancy tools, right? They're still kind of basic fundamental tools that in a way would be allowing you to simply catch up. It's really the solutions in box 3 that get interesting. And there's just one here, and that happens to be the installed tech stack. And the reason why this is super interesting is because it doesn't have a high usage rate already. So if you were to deploy that solution, that could in fact give you a competitive advantage.
So Nancy, I'll ask you the question I've asked you many times for the benefit of anyone listening in who's wondering, what is installed tech stack?
Yeah, that is a good question. So it gives you insights into what products the accounts you're selling into already have installed. So if they have installed a competitor, that's good and competitive information to give you, or for your reps to know. And then if they have complementary solutions, that also indicates that there may be a high benefit to also buying your solution because it helps with the solution you already have. And then it can also help you upsell and cross-sell if you know what solutions your prospects already have.
Got it.
That's a tricky one.
Yeah.
So I think that's all 5 of them. So we could probably move on to just some of the, or actually a way to kind of wrap up and put it all into one picture.
Yeah, perfect. So taking a look at this very colorful infographic, Hey there, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can I get a little bit of feedback from a chat perspective? All right. So Nancy and I are going to just chime right in here and take some of the questions as they come up. As long as you guys can hear us okay. It looks like we're having some issues with the audio visual here. So Nancy, if you're here and ready to go, maybe we can just start to work through some of the questions. Sure. And then to what's coming in here, I'll see if I can pull up the slides to share as well, but maybe I'll have Nancy take a question or two to give me a minute to pull up the deck if that works okay.
Sounds good.
All right. So you guys shared some great questions overall. Thank you so much for the engagement. One of the first questions that came in was around the idea of smaller companies, smaller budgets. So Nancy, as you think about some of the thinking we did around what a core sales tech stack might look like versus a more advanced one, what are your recommendations for those companies on the line that may just have kind of smaller, more limited resources to work with as they get started?
Well, I think the good news for small businesses is that the solutions that are most considered to be table stakes are ones that are not too terribly expensive and don't require too much training. Right? So if you look at video, online video meetings, obviously that's very important. And it doesn't necessarily require a lot of training and it isn't all that expensive, but that's a must-have tool. And then some of the other ones are things like, let's say, LinkedIn Sales Navigator or Zoom Info, something that's going to give your reps the ability to find the right accounts and contacts and the information on how to reach them. So that's good. And then, you can use some basic tools like Office products to store and share content. So there is some good, tools that are available that are on the basic end and don't cost a lot for smaller businesses. Unfortunately, a lot of the newer, interesting tools are really aimed at enterprise. And I think, a good way to understand which tools those are is when you go to their website. If they don't offer pricing, that tells me that they are in enterprise only. If they are also available for SMBs, they'll likely have some tiered pricing and will disclose the pricing information for the entry level tiers.
Oh, I was muted. Thanks, Nancy. I think a great place to start. And again, for anybody listening in, we do have some perspective on what that starter sales tech stack might look like versus more advanced functionality. So we'll certainly share a little bit of that out as well. Next question, Nancy, that came in is you think about tools that are helpful for executives who are looking to boost their confidence in their forecast. How do you think about that question? What types of capabilities would you direct everybody on the line towards?
Well, there are a lot of different approaches to solving that problem. One is to make sure that reps have a good understanding of what's expected at each stage, and also that managers have a way to coach on deals, not just coach on skill set, but also coach on deals themselves. And so there are tools that help with both of those. And then there's also tools that help managers identify more leading indicators that would tell you whether there's risk in the forecast or not. And typically we could only understand whether or not we were going to hit our quota once we were just a few days away from close of month, because we just based on what deals have come in. But now with tools like Clarion, Aviso, and Insight Squared by Mediafly, there are ways to get some predictive analytics based on what's happened in the past and how that might, shed light on your current deals. So those are very interesting solutions. And then there's a whole another slice of tools, which is the conversation intelligence solutions, and they are now calling themselves revenue intelligence. But the gist of it is that you're recording sales calls, and from the outcome of those calls and what took place during those calls, you can get some pretty interesting insights. Like if a competitor is mentioned or a particular competitor is mentioned, what are the odds that we typically go on to get that deal? So there's lots of good nuggets that you can learn and uncover through those types of solutions as well.
Yep, I think great information for everybody here on the line. We'll do a couple more questions here. If we don't get to your question, we'll certainly follow up afterwards. And then in the last couple minutes, I'll pull up those last few slides just to round us out. But Nancy, one of the things you and I talked about prior to today is where there's the most innovation. So I'm looking at the question that came in from Brett. When you think about exciting new capabilities that are beginning to creep onto the sales tech or broader commercial tech scene, what are some of the capabilities that you find the most exciting?
Yeah, that's a common question I get, and it makes sense because you want to know about all of these interesting new technologies. And I will answer the question, but I just want to preface it with that I think there are a lot of fundamental kinds of technologies that aren't being deployed. So I would just suggest that people, think in terms of, do we have the fundamentals covered? Because often organizations don't. So having said that, I will say that there are a number of very interesting solutions coming down the pike. I like ones that are that I refer to as conversation optimization tools. So these are things that will allow you to, or a rep to, set up a call and get some prompts as they're talking to someone. I even saw one the other day that works right inside Zoom. So you can have playbooks right inside your Zoom online meeting. The prospect does not see what the rep is being prompted for, but it provides some really good information so that the rep can have good quality outcomes and not so much just forcing them to practice on a real live client. You're backing it up with some information in real time. And that leads me to another category that I like, which is, what was I going to say? Has to do with optimization, conversation optimization, and having access to the content immediately. I forget what it was, but I'll think about it and I'll jump back in.
Perfect, Nancy. And just checking, does the visual look okay on your end?
It does.
Perfect. Okay, a couple other questions before I start to walk through this slide. A couple folks were asking about roadmap overall. So one of the things we were pretty surprised by was to see a really limited number of tools on most organizations, 12 to 18-month roadmaps. And I think someone rightly raised the question that planning out and sequencing and phasing a lot of technology can come with pretty big budget asks. So Nancy, how do you think about getting executive level buy-in around more of a forward-looking roadmap?
Well, I think it depends on really what you're getting from the culture, right? And what you're hearing from senior management. It has to come from senior management. They have to really be behind it. But if you don't have that yet, I still think you could approach it by thinking through the roadmap, thinking through what makes sense to do when and in what order. And by the way, we have a model for that in terms of these 7 stages and how to think about what are the right tools to get and in what order. So we're happy to talk to you about that. But if you put that together in your own, with some good logic and a plan for how you will roll that out or what you're proposing, then I think it's possible to get senior management buy-in and to say, okay, not only will we get the technology, but we are going to have a process for deciding how to evaluate, how to purchase these types of solutions, who's going to be responsible for what. It's something I refer to as EBAT, which we'll probably have on another slide, but that's who's going to be responsible for evaluating this technology, who's going to benefit from the technology, and have we made sure that we are actually getting from them a good understanding of what they need. And then A is who is going to be responsible for administering those solutions and making sure that they're maintained and kept up to date with content, et cetera. And then who's going to be training. If you have all of those elements in place, along with what the roadmap is for types of technology, then I think it's actually easier to get budget allocated over time than to just go and say, hey, we saw this really cool tool and we could really use it because it's going to help us do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think great context and great advice for everybody thinking about, what is the right amount of ask and how do I think about sequencing and connecting to outcomes overall? Steve, you asked a really interesting question that has just prompted about 3 ideas for new research from my mind. For everyone on the line, Steve asked if we saw any correlation between the use of a tool and an organization's market condition. We didn't look at the analysis that way, but we did factor in the rate of growth a company is experiencing. Interestingly, we saw people adding in the most new technology, new capability when they were kind of mid-range. We essentially took the growth rates and divided the whole survey population into thirds. And it was that middle group of, call it kind of mid-growth range companies that were adding in the most capability, probably looking to play catch up to some extent. And also, quickly, rapidly transforming to greater scale and adding in tools to help and to automate some of those more manual activities. So great question there. Nancy, I'll give you one more, and then maybe we'll jump over to the slides. There's a question that came in from Kate around some of the lower adoption stats that we saw. Her question was, do you think some of the low adoption is because lots of tools have overlapping functionality? Which is, I think, a good question, but could then prompt a whole series of next actions for a company to take. So what's your thought on that?
Well, yeah, that is an interesting question. I suppose you could say that, yes, that could be a factor for sure, because, it's likely that a company could have multiple tools that all help with the same thing, or they bought it for something and it can do a lot more. We didn't really query to uncover that kind of data, but I think a recommendation for, just based on this question, would be to take stock of where you are today and what tools you have, because then you can look to see, well, what is the overlap? And maybe we can start to consolidate the tools that we have in our stack so that we could spend more time, ensuring that we have better utilization of each one. And that'll reduce the cost of licenses as well as training and administration and all of that as well.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. To bring our time to a close, I'll turn everybody's attention to a bit of an eye chart, but I think a pretty cool one to take a look at as you look at the screen. What we wanted to do was summarize everything we learned as easily as possible. So this doesn't quite include 100% of our findings, but it probably includes about half in some respects. So you see our visualization of the overall sales process from prioritize to engage all the way through to manage and develop. As you look at this graphic, the dark blue that you see in the center of the screen indicates the majority of companies are using the tools that you see with that dark blue backing. So lead engagement, sales engagement, contract proposals, for example. Moving your way outward, as the coloring gets lighter, you begin to see fewer and fewer companies using the tools. So the middle is about 50 to 75% of respondents are using the tools, and then less than half when you get to the outer ring there. So that's definitely where you see, I think, some of the more innovative categories for certain, but also maybe some opportunities as you think about tools that you may not yet have, but your competitors likewise may not have them either as you think about optimizing the customer experience in particular. The next layer of information that you'll see in this graphic is just the level of importance. So again, back to some of what Nancy shared, the importance category means a company shared that the tool was critical to their day-to-day operations. So the size of the bubble shows how important that tool is. And then to bring in our last layer of information, level of adoption is green, yellow, red. So a big bubble for high, shaded with green, shows really important tool, really well adopted. By contrast, if you look at a big bubble and you see that it's red, really important tool not being used that well, that should set off alarm bells. And then you can look at lower importance tools, the small bubbles, and perhaps question, are they unimportant because they've just been installed and the organization's still learning how to use them? Or are they underused because they perhaps need to be evaluated? So a couple things to consider there. We will share these slides for everyone that's asked, but wanted to give a quick walk through this one. And then as we make our way just to a couple of overview slides here at the end, we summarized a couple of overall takeaways here. They're aligned with the structure we walked through. But key takeaway number one, there are a lot of tools out there and a lot of tools to begin to uncover. And so understanding your current state with a SMART framework like your sales process is a great way to initially benchmark exactly where you're at today. Two, thinking about where you have the biggest business priority, where KPIs are turning red, that might be a good way to prioritize or assess what you have at work as well. Second, if you remember the donut chart, I like to call it, that Nancy shared, processes for sales tech are relatively immature as we look at the data we gathered here. So think about what your buying process looks like. Are you always involving consistent stakeholders as you look at new technology? How does the implementation process, training, driving ongoing adoption? How does that work? Do you have good standards to share with vendors that you're bringing in? Thinking about maturing those processes, great takeaway. Adoption and underleveraged solutions. So you just saw on our color wheel that certainly, there are very important tools out there that aren't utilized very well today. So think about overall, how can you pinpoint where you have critical tools to your day-to-day, where there's room to unlock additional capability. Next one, sellers aren't motivated or enabled to use the tools. Get some feedback from your sales force directly. Our data reflects sales leaders in large part, people in enablement and operations, but take a little bit of time to understand what sellers have a great experience using and where they struggle, and really think about, why do we continue to invest in some of those tools that sellers don't like using all that much? Does the good outweigh the bad in terms of potential impact to the business? And then last but not least, roadmap. Think about your business needs first versus what sales managers might be asking for, and begin to sequence and outline what tools you need, how they impact capabilities and processes in place, and go from there. So hopefully some good takeaways to leave you all with. You can visit our website at sbigrowth.com. We have a couple blogs that go deeper into sales tech as well. And we're always happy to have additional conversations. We will follow up with the recording and the deck within the next day. In addition, if you shared some questions with us that we didn't get to, we will look to get back in touch with you on those as well. So thank you again so much for your time today, for your patience as we navigated the technical difficulties, and we look forward to chatting again soon. Thank you.